Geneva, 1974, and the fluorescent lights in the World Health Assembly Hall hum at a frequency that sounds almost like translation, everything rendered simultaneously into 6 languages, every word carrying the weight of 6 possible meanings, every pause in one tongue becoming a rushed syllable in another, the whole room suspended in the particular unreality of international bureaucracy, where consequence moves slowly and language moves fast. Mike Muller, a British journalist and researcher, holds a document in his lap. 48 pages, typewritten, stapled, mimeographed on a machine that left faint grey shadows at the page margins. The cover shows a feeding bottle. Below it, a question that no one in that room has yet agreed how to answer, and no one will agree how to answer for the next 5 decades. The pamphlet is called The Baby Killer, published by War on Want in London, and by the time Muller carried it into that hall, 3,000 copies were already moving across Europe, photocopied, passed hand to hand through church halls and university common rooms, and the cluttered offices of development organizations, the paper slightly warm from whoever had held it last, the ink slightly smeared from whoever had read it urgently. And then Nestlé's lawyers read one and reached for the telephone. A libel case would be filed in Switzerland within weeks. The world would notice. But to understand how a pamphlet became a lawsuit, became a global boycott, became a voluntary international code that is still voluntary today, you have to go back to 1867 and to a riverside factory town in Switzerland where the smell of milled grain and coal smoke hung low over the water, and a German-born pharmacist named Henri Nestlé was trying to solve a problem that had nothing to do with corporations and everything to do with a child who could not eat. Nestlé was 53 years old in 1867, trained in chemistry, childless, practical in the manner of men who believe that most problems yield to method if you apply enough patience and enough heat. The infant was a neighbor's child, premature, unable to nurse, losing weight in the way that infants lost weight in the 19th century, which meant losing the contest with a quietness that the adults around the bed could not interrupt. Nestlé mixed wheat flour, cow's milk, and sugar, baked the result to a pale powder, dissolved it in warm water, and fed it to the child in small quantities at measured intervals. The child survived, that is the documented origin, recorded in Nestlé's own company history and in the municipal memory of Vevey. What is also documented, though it appeared in no prominent place on any label for many years afterward, is that the formula derived roughly half its calories from sugar, a pharmaceutical convenience born of preservation requirements, a detail that would not be seriously interrogated for another century. Nestlé sold his mixture as farine lactée, wrapped in a paper bag printed with a bird and nest emblem he had designed himself, and within months, local physicians were recommending it in cases where nursing was impossible. Within years, it was moving to France, Germany, and Britain, carried in trunks and sample cases by traveling salesmen who understood that a physician's recommendation was worth more than any advertisement. The product worked. In households with clean water from municipal pipes, with measuring spoons in kitchen drawers, with literate parents who could follow instructions printed in careful German, the product genuinely and verifiably worked. That is the irony that drives everything that follows. Not that Henri Nestlé made something dangerous, but that he made something real, something that answered a real human need with a real chemical solution, and that the solution's success became the engine of its own worst consequences. He was not fleeing the future. He had no ideology of expansion, no vision of a global empire built on powder. He was a pharmacist with a dead child in a neighbor's house and a method. He solved the immediate problem in front of him with the tools available to him in 1867. He could not solve the century that followed him. By 1905, Henri Nestlé was dead, and his name had been purchased and merged into something larger. The consolidation between the Nestlé Company and the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company, completed that year under the chairmanship of Louis Dapples, created something qualitatively different from a successful Swiss food business with good distribution in Western Europe. It created a logistics organism, a body whose purpose was not simply to make a product, but to move that product across the largest possible geography in the shortest possible time at the lowest possible cost. The technology that made this possible was the hermetically sealed tin, whose engineering logic had first proven itself during the American Civil War, when condensed milk in sealed cans survived ocean crossings and battlefield conditions that would have destroyed any other dairy product. Now that same logic was applied to infant formula. Tins embossed with the bird and nest, soldered shut at the seam, loaded by the thousand into the holds of ships in Hamburg and Rotterdam, and unloaded weeks later in Bombay and Lagos and Singapore without having spoiled, without having changed in any measurable way from the product that left the factory floor. The merger prospectus, filed with the Swiss Federal Commercial Register in 1905, was a document about logistics as much as food science, factories operating in 7 countries within 8 years of the merger, and by 1938 manufacturing infrastructure on 6 continents. The exact factory count and locations requiring archival verification, but their continental spread well established in corporate histories of the period. The colonial trade routes of the British and Dutch empires were not incidental to this expansion. They were the circulatory system through which the organism moved. Every new factory was a new organ, processing local raw materials into standardized product and feeding it back into the global distribution network. The organism was growing with the confidence of something that had never encountered a limit it could not engineer around. Scale had solved the logistics. It could not solve the instructions. The tin that crossed the ocean still assumed what the original paper bag had assumed in 1867. A kitchen with a stove, water from a clean municipal tap, a mother who could read fine print in 4 languages, a refrigerator for the opened container, a measuring spoon of calibrated accuracy. None of that was printed on the front face of the tin. All of it was required for the product to be safe. The gap between what the label assumed and what the world actually contained was, from Vivi, invisible. It would not remain invisible forever. The Second World War accelerated the organism's reach in ways that took nearly a decade to fully register. By the middle 1950s, Nestlé and its competitors had identified the post-colonial developing world as the primary growth market for infant formula, and they had a method of entering it that was elegant in its operational simplicity and devastating in its downstream consequences. In the maternity wards of Lagos, Nairobi, Sao Paulo, and Karachi, wards with diesel generators that ran intermittently through the afternoon heat, with cotton screens between iron-framed beds, with ceiling fans that moved the air without cooling it, Nestlé employed local women as sales representatives. The company dressed them in white uniforms and provided them with certificates, not medical certificates issued by a hospital or a licensing board. Company certificates printed in Vevey certifying that the bearer had completed Nestlé's own training program. They were called milk nurses, and their job was to visit new mothers in the ward in the first hours and days after birth, during the precise biological window in which breast milk supply is establishing itself through demand, and to offer a free tin of formula. The Nestlé promotional materials from this era, later cited in IBFAN archives and partially reproduced in Muller's pamphlet, show smiling women in white uniforms beside new mothers in hospital beds, the composition deliberate, the association between the white uniform and medical authority unmistakable and entirely intentional. The tins were free. The logic was not charity. Once a mother uses formula in the first days after birth, breast milk supply begins to decrease because the demand signal that sustains it is absent. Within a week of consistent formula feeding, the body adjusts. Within 2 weeks, the adjustment is often irreversible. By the time the new mother is discharged from the hospital, by the time the free tin is empty and the white uniformed woman has moved on to the next ward, the biological alternative is frequently no longer available in sufficient quantity to sustain the infant alone. And then the tin costs money. A tin of Nestlé formula in Nigeria in the late 1960s represented a cost that consumed a substantial portion of a low-income family's weekly income, the precise figure requiring verification from economic histories of the period, but whose approximate magnitude was documented by multiple independent investigators. A mother who cannot afford the correct dosage does what mothers facing scarcity have always done. She stretches it. She measures by instinct rather than the calibrated spoon. She adds more water than the instructions specify. The water comes from a tap or a communal well or a river, and in the urban peripheries of Lagos and Karachi and Sao Paulo in 1965, it is frequently contaminated with bacteria that a healthy adult digestive system can manage and that an infant's cannot. By 1970, Nestlé held an estimated half of the global infant formula market, the primary source for that figure requiring verification, but its approximate scale was not contested. The sample was free. The dependency it created was not. In Vevey, meanwhile, the organism had reached the configuration that organisms reach at their apex, a settled confidence in its own indispensability, a bureaucratic smoothness that had long since ceased to notice the friction it created at its edges. A marble lobby, telex machines receiving sales figures from 50 countries simultaneously, a wall map of the world studded with colored pins marking production facilities and distribution hubs, the pins so numerous in Europe and North America that the continents looked almost solid. The Nestlé chief executive in the late 1960s, most likely Pierre Lyotard Vogt, whose name and tenure would require archival confirmation from Swiss corporate records, presided over operations in more than 50 countries with revenues in which infant formula and condensed milk together constituted a significant fraction of consolidated income, the precise revenue breakdown requiring verification from accessible annual reports. The multilingual instruction panel on each tin detailed the preparation procedure in 4 languages with technical precision. Bring water to a rolling boil, allow to cool to a specific temperature, add exactly the measured quantity of powder, sterilize the bottle before each use, refrigerate any unused prepared formula and discard after 24 hours. These instructions were printed on the side panel in type small enough to require good light and reading glasses. Nothing on the front face of the tin indicated that following these instructions was anything other than a reasonable expectation. Nothing in the marketing materials, which showed plump and contented infants in warm domestic interiors, acknowledged the conditions in which the product was actually being prepared in Karachi or Nairobi. Headquarters had designed the product for the European kitchen and exported it, without redesign and without contextual adjustment, into environments where the assumed infrastructure did not exist. No feedback mechanism connected the field outcomes to the boardroom. No system existed for routing reports of infant illness in Lagos back to the chemists in Vevey. The product was not wrong, the context was, and headquarters could not see the context from Switzerland. The first person to name what was happening did not work for Nestlé and had no commercial stake in the outcome. Dr. Derek Jelliff, a British paediatrician and nutrition researcher who had spent substantial time in hospitals across West Africa and South Asia, published a paper in the Journal of Tropical Pediatrics in 1971 introducing the term commerciogenic malnutrition, malnutrition produced not by poverty alone, not by drought or crop failure or the ancient enemies of food security, but by commercial practice that deliberately displaced safer and freely available alternatives. Jelliff had watched what happened in ward after ward when formula marketing intersected with inadequate income, contaminated water, and insufficient literacy. On the walls of those wards, donated by Nestlé and by other formula manufacturers as a gesture of corporate goodwill toward public health infrastructure, hung posters depicting formula-fed babies who were visibly and convincingly thriving, round-cheeked, bright-eyed, displayed in the visual language of medical endorsement. The posters hung alongside nursing staff charts and immunization schedules, their placement suggesting an equivalence of authority. Jelliff's paper moved through the academic literature with the deliberate pace of peer-reviewed science. Pediatricians in Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Brazil began citing it, adding their own clinical observations to the accumulating record. The data was imperfect, genuinely contested in its methodology, resistant to clean causal attribution, because the chain of causation between a marketing practice and a specific infant death runs through poverty and water quality and maternal education, and a dozen other compounding variables that resist clean disentanglement. UNICEF estimated in the 1970s that approximately 1 million infant deaths per year in developing countries were associated with unsafe artificial feeding, a figure that was subsequently disputed on methodological grounds and must be understood as an estimate of association rather than a confirmed causal count, the original UNICEF source requiring citation. What was not disputed was the direction in which the accumulating clinical evidence pointed consistently across multiple independent researchers, across multiple countries, across multiple years. Science had built the empire. Now science was putting it on trial, imperfectly, slowly, publicly. And a British journalist was about to make the trial impossible to ignore. The baby killer landed in 1974, and Nestlé's response was the response of an institution that had never been seriously challenged and did not yet understand the difference between a legal problem and a legitimacy problem. The company filed a libel suit, not against War on Want in London, whose English-language pamphlets circulated in a relatively contained activist network, but against the Third World Action Group in Switzerland, a small collective that had translated and distributed a German-language version under the title Nestlé tötet Kinder, Nestlé kills children, across West Germany, Switzerland, and reportedly 8 or 9 other European countries, the precise distribution figure requiring archival verification. Nestlé's legal team was institutional, well-resourced, and moved with the procedural confidence of a corporation accustomed to winning in courtrooms. The Bern District Court case ran for approximately 2 years. Nestlé won on a narrow legal point. The precise formulation of the pamphlet's title was held to exceed what the available evidence strictly demonstrated. But the judge's accompanying statement, widely reported in the international press and summarized in subsequent coverage, characterized Nestlé's marketing practices as immoral and unethical. The legal victory was architecturally a catastrophe. A document that might have circulated among perhaps 10,000 European activists and then faded was now front-page news in every major Western newspaper. Every lawyer deployed, every procedural motion filed, every day of courtroom testimony had amplified the activists' message with a precision and a reach that no activist organization could have achieved through its own resources. Nestlé's institutional power, its very capacity to fight and win a 2-year Swiss libel case, was precisely what turned a fringe pamphlet into a global story. They won the case. They lost the room. The room, by 1977, had moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where a coalition called the Infant Formula Action Coalition, InFact, convened in a church hall with folding tables and mimeographed flyers that carried, in their typewritten materiality, an unmistakable visual echo of the 1974 pamphlet. Doug Johnson, InFact's principal organizer, and Sister Marilyn Uline, who anchored the campaign within the American faith community, understood something that Nestlé's legal department had inadvertently demonstrated in Bern. The company's most exposed surface in wealthy Western consumer markets was not its infant formula, which American and European consumers did not buy. It was its chocolate, its confectionery, its coffee. The products on grocery shelves that millions of ordinary consumers purchased weekly, whose brand loyalty was habitual and whose abandonment required only a sticker, "Don't buy Nestlé," applied to the wrapper by a volunteer on a Tuesday afternoon. The boycotts spread through church networks, university campuses, hospital worker unions, and progressive consumer organizations across North America and subsequently across Western Europe. Estimates of total participant numbers reached into the tens of millions over the boycott's 7-year run, the primary source for precise figures requiring archival verification from InFact's own records, archived at the University of Minnesota. Nestlé's confectionery sales in key American markets declined measurably during peak boycott years, the financial data accessible in the company's annual reports from the period. The weapon was not a lawsuit. It was a chocolate bar left on the shelf. While the boycott ran, a parallel and slower process was building in Geneva. The World Health Assembly had been deliberating for years over a code of conduct governing the marketing of breast milk substitutes, and on May 21, 1981, in a hall whose fluorescent lights hummed with the same frequency as 1974, delegates from 118 nations voted in favor of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. 12 pages, 18 articles. Dr. Halfdan Mahler, the WHO Director General, had anchored the years-long negotiation. One nation voted against, the United States, whose delegate cast the dissenting vote under instructions from the Reagan administration, the delegate's name requiring archival confirmation. 3 nations abstained. Article 5.2 prohibited the distribution of free samples to mothers. Article 6.2 prohibited advertising directly to the public. The code contained no enforcement mechanism of any kind. It was a statement of international moral consensus, not a legal instrument. Nestlé publicly committed to full compliance. IBFAN, the International Baby Food Action Network, was established as an independent monitoring organization. IBFAN's field monitors began documenting violations almost immediately. The code had no teeth, but it had a name, and that name would follow the company for the next 4 decades. In January 1984, Nestlé and InFact signed a 4-page compliance agreement. A press conference in Vevey, Helmut Maucher at a lectern, a handshake photograph. InFact suspended the boycott after 7 years, announcing the agreement as a significant and meaningful victory for the campaign. The international press covered the resolution with the relief that journalists bring to stories that appear to have ended. Both things, the signing and the relief, were partially accurate and substantially incomplete. Within months, IBFAN's field monitors in Pakistan, Bangladesh and Nigeria were documenting the continued distribution of free samples in maternity wards. In October 1988, IBFAN published the first edition of a report titled Breaking the Rules, documenting active code violations across 14 countries. The boycott was reinstated. The third and most structurally revealing twist had arrived. Not a dramatic rupture, but a slow and undeniable disclosure. Nestlé had signed the agreement. Nestlé had held the press conference. Nestlé had issued the policy document and the compliance statement and the letterhead commitments. The violations existed simultaneously in the wards of hospitals in Lahore and Dhaka and Lagos, documented in photographs and shipping records and the testimonies of health workers. Both were checkable. Both were simultaneously true. The gap between corporate communication and documented field practice was not primarily a problem of bad faith in the boardroom. It was a structural problem. The incentive architecture of a business whose revenues depended on formula adoption, operating in markets where regulatory enforcement was minimal and monitoring capacity was limited, signing commitments whose verification relied entirely on the same NGOs the company had once tried to silence in court. An agreement was signed. A photograph was taken. The samples kept arriving. Breaking the Rules became a publication series that outlasted the careers of everyone who founded it. IBFAN produced new editions roughly every 3 years, each one a thick dossier of field documentation, photographs of hospital wall posters, records of free sample distribution, pricing surveys, country-by-country violation logs compiled by local health workers and researchers who did the unglamorous work of actually showing up and writing things down. The editions accumulated across more than 3 decades, from 1988 through the early 2020s, each one iterating the same structural finding with new evidence from new countries, the monitoring cycle without resolution becoming its own form of institutional testimony. IBFAN's reports in the early 2020s documented violations across more than 25 countries, the precise figure requiring verification against the most recent edition. WHO monitoring as of 2022 identified formula marketing practices undermining breastfeeding recommendations across more than 150 countries, the figure requiring primary source confirmation. Each cycle proceeded identically. IBFAN published its findings, Nestlé issued a compliance statement, a new edition documented new violations, the statement was issued again. The report came out. The samples kept arriving. The report came out again. The statement said compliance. The photographs said otherwise. In Vevey in 2023, a Nestlé sustainability report was published as a PDF with clean typography, professional photography, and a dedicated section on responsible marketing. Nestlé CEO Mark Schneider, who had led the company since 2017, was cited in the document's framing. The Nestlé Responsible Marketing Policy of 2023 ran to 22 pages and cited the WHO code by name throughout. It committed the company to no advertising targeting children under 36 months of age. It committed to responsible labeling and to supporting health worker education on breastfeeding. It did not resolve the question of free sample distribution in low-income healthcare settings, where the mechanism of market entry that had been documented since the 1960s continued to operate in the gap between policy language and field reality. Nestlé's global infant formula revenues in 2022 reached multiple billions of Swiss francs. the precise figure verifiable in the company's published annual report. The WHO, drawing on a landmark series published in The Lancet in 2016, estimated that optimal breastfeeding globally could prevent hundreds of thousands of infant deaths annually, a figure that encompassed multiple contributing factors extending well beyond any single company's conduct, and which required careful attribution to its original source rather than flattened summary. The International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, voted into existence on May 21, 1981, with one dissenting vote and the weight of 118 nations behind it, remained a voluntary instrument in 2024. Fewer than 40 countries had enacted domestic legislation giving it legal force, the figure requiring verification against the most current WHO legislative mapping. No external body held enforcement authority over any corporation in the remaining countries. Nestlé published its compliance documentation, and it was genuine as documentation. IBFAN published its violation documentation, and it was genuine as documentation. Both lived simultaneously in the same world, separated not by dishonesty but by the distance between a policy written in Vevey and a hospital ward in Karachi, a distance that no press conference had yet closed. And then there is a museum display case in Vevey, if you go looking for it. Henri Nestlé's original farine lactée packaging from 1867, preserved behind glass in the particular stillness of objects that have outlasted everyone who touched them. Pale paper, worn soft at the edges, the Bird Nest emblem printed in the ink of a world that had not yet imagined sustainability reports or WHO resolutions or global boycotts organized from church halls in Minneapolis. The smell of flour and sugar is entirely gone, dissolved into a century and a half of air. Beside it, in a modern tin with a glossy surface and a barcode and a WHO code compliance statement printed in fine type on the back panel, is what the powder became across 157 years of scaling and merging and litigating and signing and monitoring and issuing statements and documenting violations. The camera would hold on the paper bag, cut to the tin, hold. Outside the museum in Geneva, the fluorescent lights in the World Health Assembly Hall still hum. The translation earpieces are still in their cradles. The mimeographed pamphlet from 1974 is in the British Library, catalogued and checkable, its pages still carrying the faint grey shadows of a machine that pressed urgency into paper. The question printed below the bottle on its cover was never fully answered. Henri Nestlé never knew what his powder would become. The institution that carries his name has had 50 years to decide. The decision is still being made.